one of my Ouija boards actually sold, which is super cool because usually they don't sell. And 2 weekends ago, I had a couple of crazy experiences where I had one woman walk by with her really young child and freak out after she saw my Ouija boards and yank her kid back as hard as she could and was like, "We are not supposed to, this is not for us," as loud as she possibly could for me and everybody else in the world to hear. And which is just rude, but whatever. And I'm used to stuff like that. I've been to events where people have actively walked around my booth to avoid it, but they're usually pretty quiet, so she's loud, whatever. And then an hour or two later, or no, this was the next day, this other woman sees my booth and does the sign of the cross and stares at me like I'm the devil incarnate, and then keeps walking. So I'm already feeling some kind of whiplash because that's what I get 2 weekends ago. And then this past weekend, someone buys it and they look so fucking thrilled to see it and to have it and to be able to experience my art and have it in their home. And that is so cool. But the Ouija board thing is my biggest pet peeve. Not just as an artist, but as a practitioner of witchcraft. The Ouija board is no different than a pendulum. In fact, it works off of the same principle, the ideomotor effect, where your body can't actually physically sit completely still. You have a lot of micro movements that your body cannot control. And the witchy woo interpretation of that is what I like to call a micro possession, meaning that your conscious mind is so detached from your body that it is easier for a spirit to then possess your arm or use your movements to move the planchette and or the pendulum, right? Same exact effect, right? But we have people saying that pendulums, fine. Ouija boards, devil. And here's my issue with that. Because that is years and years and years of propaganda by the church. So let's rewind to the Spiritualist Movement. Have been doing a lot of research lately for an episode of my podcast about the history of witchcraft. And I fell down this rabbit hole of spiritualism specifically in America, and I started with, of course, the Salem witch trials. And I think most people know now that witches were not actually in Salem. They did not actually burn witches. They burned women and men that they had just personal beef with. It also wasn't even really about land, which I will do a whole other episode on, or a whole other video on. But basis is, I started with that and I ended up at the Spiritualist Movement. And this is when seances started to get popular in the 1800s and the 1840s. The Spiritualist Movement was intertwined with women's voting rights and with abolition of slavery. And so a lot of people who were spiritualists were also activists in these areas. And that was completely counter to what the church wanted. It was completely counter to what politicians wanted at the time. And because all three of these movements were so intertwined together, there was a smear campaign for all of it. And don't get me wrong, there were bad faith actors. There were people who were not actually mediums or who didn't actually believe in what they were doing. And they were legitimately just trying to make a buck. And that happens. And we see it all the time now. But the podcast I was listening to, one of the historians, they made a very good point that we see that in all professions. This isn't just something inherent to the spiritual community or to witchcraft. You see lawyers do it. You see medical practitioners do it. Throughout history, there's always going to be some opportunist dickhead that decides, I need to make a buck off this because it's popular right now. And so you get a lot of people doing this in bad faith. And so the church and the politician just decided, we're going to use this to further our smear campaign. And they made their own magazines, they made their own newspapers to talk about this, and they put people on blast. And so then after they put these people on blast, it just wasn't working. It was getting actually even more popular, and they couldn't understand it. And then towards the end of the Spiritualist Movement, because they were doing seances, and the way that they did seances was they would write letters on a table, and they would ask questions, and then they would wait until they heard a knocking sound at one of the letters. And then once you would hear a knocking sound at one of the letters, you would write that down. And seance sessions would take hours and hours and hours to try to decipher what these messages were. And a lot of the time, these messages were messages of abolition, messages of free love, messages of women's rights, messages of doing good and being together and being part of one, that we are all connected. And I'll do a different video on this later too, because there's another thing that pisses me off, because of course it does, because I get pissed off at everything. And the church was not having it. And that version of a seance was not very conducive to doing things at home if you were not a professional medium at the time. And so we get the Ouija board. And it was just a way for it to be more accessible, big truck, a way for it to be more accessible to the public. And that was so the church came out, and I say the church as an institution. At this point, there is so many different factions of the Christian church that are being made, and there's a bunch of infighting at the same time that all of this is happening. And they start telling people in their magazines and in their newspapers that they're not actually talking to who they think that they're talking to. They get told that they're actually talking to demons. And that's why it's not okay for you to do it, because you're inviting Satan into your home. So you get this for years, right? It doesn't actually decrease the popularity of Ouija boards. We get the Civil War that happens, and the Spiritualist movement doesn't die, but it definitely goes underground. And the Spiritualist movement is very disjointed and disorganized, and there's all these different people doing all these different things, and there's all these different mediums doing all these different showcasing of their talent, giving these messages to people. And at some point, there's a push to get it to be more organized, which I have my own opinions on that. And so it kind of goes, I don't want to say underground, but there's more of a push for it to be about and less about activism and healing the world and being there for your fellow man and neighbor. And it starts to become more of a, how do you just better yourself as a person? How can this help you? How can this be there for you? And I think we've seen this in spirituality and New Age thought on religion and spirituality, where we see this shift in thought and opinion. And I think we're seeing it right now, where everything is all self-help based and outside of the realm of the woo-woo. And because it's outside of the realm of the woo-woo, it makes it seem less scary to other people. I liken it to basically our version of a PR campaign. We don't want to get looked at like the crazies, and so we go in this opposite direction to make sure that we don't look bad. And so that kind of happened. So a lot of people will sit there and say that the Ouija board propaganda was started by the movie The Exorcist. And while that is partially true, it actually started at the actual formation of Ouija boards and the formation of the Spiritualist Movement. And it made the church look bad. Why would you go to church to be told what Spirit had to say to you or what God had to say to you if you could just reach out and do it yourself? It takes the power away from the church. It takes the power away from the political institution that we had. It discredits them and then puts it back into the hands of the people. So when I see people so blatantly disrespectful to me about my art and so scared of literally a piece of wood, I just want you to understand why. People will say, oh, I had a bad experience. What was your bad experience? And then they'll tell me that the bad experience was they asked a question and they got an answer. Isn't that the point? Didn't you ask because you wanted an answer? I'm confused. Aren't you not spiritual? Don't you use tarot cards and use pendulums and meditate and try to reach out to your spirit guides? But the Ouija board's bad? Can someone make it make sense, please? The Ouija board is not a portal to hell. You have been told, indoctrinated, and propagandized to believe that that is what it is. It is absolutely no different than anything else you're doing. You need to be careful with it because you need to be careful with any kind of spiritual tool. This is not a different or new thing. Please sit with yourself and ask yourself why you have the prejudices and biases that you do about things in the world. And I can guarantee you that 9 times out of 10, it probably has to do with the Christian church.